The spring of 1734 came late to the colony of Maryland, dragging its cold breath across the marshes like the last sigh of a dying saint. The rains had been heavy that year, the river swollen and angry, eroding its own banks as if trying to cleanse the land of its memory. Along its northern bend stood the Thornton estate, 3 stories of brick and arrogance, rising from the earth like a verdict that could not be appealed. The house had belonged to the Thornton family for nearly a century, its foundations older than the colony itself. Built first as a trading hall, then expanded into a mansion, it had seen generations of men rise and fall beneath its shadow. By the spring of 1734, the estate belonged to Nathaniel Thornton, a man both feared and revered in equal measure, a landowner whose wealth came not merely from tobacco and trade, but from secrets whispered behind sealed doors. Nathaniel's face bore the calm of piety, but his hands, thick and scarred from old work, betrayed something more ancient than virtue. He had inherited the estate from his father, Captain Elias Thornton, whose name was still spoken in the local taverns with the same mixture of awe and disgust reserved for men who died both rich and damned. Elias had been a merchant in name, a smuggler in practice, and a trafficker in everything that could be weighed, measured, and hidden. The legend of the Thornton family began not with its wealth, but with its silence. Each generation built upon the sins of the last, concealing them beneath new coats of plaster and prayer. The chapel beside the manor, built by Elias in 1699, was said to house the family's Book of Grace, a great leather-bound volume containing the confessions of every Thornton since their arrival from England. Each patriarch had written in it before his death, ensuring that no sin, however grave, would be lost to memory. Nathaniel, however, had never written in it. He claimed that confession was for weak men and that his strength came from divine favor. God rewards those who act, he told his children, not those who weep. His wife, Margaret, believed him once. But by 1734, she prayed in silence, her rosary worn smooth from years of unanswered petitions. She had birthed 3 children, Eleanor, the eldest, beautiful and sharp as frost, Henry, the heir apparent, who had inherited both his father's temper and his mother's melancholy, and Samuel, the youngest, quiet and observant, who preferred to linger near the chapel rather than the dining table. The Thornton household was large, its servants numerous, but none dared to speak freely. There were rules here, unwritten ones enforced not by violence but by fear. Doors were to be locked after sundown. No one was to enter the cellar after vespers, and no one, under any circumstances, was to question the purpose of the sealed room beneath the chapel. It was said that Elias Thornton himself had sealed it before his death, after a matter of conscience drove him to madness. Priests had been summoned, rituals performed, but the door remained locked, and Nathaniel forbade it ever to be opened. On the morning of April 6, 1734, a letter arrived from England. It was sealed with the crest of the Church of St. Dunstan's, the same parish that had once expelled Nathaniel's father. The letter was brief, written in a hand both elegant and urgent. The account of Elias Thornton remains unsettled. The debt must be answered, not in coin, but in confession. The blood remembers. Nathaniel burned the letter in his study, but the ash refused to die cleanly. For days afterward, a faint mark, like a brand, remained upon the hearthstone. That evening, Margaret found her husband kneeling before the chapel door, his lips moving in a language she did not recognize. When she touched his shoulder, he turned sharply, eyes wide, as though she had interrupted a negotiation rather than a prayer. "Do not enter here after nightfall," he said, "not for me, not for anyone." From that night onward, the manor began to change. Servants reported hearing footsteps in the corridors long after the family had retired. Candles burned low of their own accord. The bells of the chapel, long disused, began to ring faintly during storms, though no wind touched them. Henry dismissed it as superstition. Elena refused to leave her room after dusk. Only Samuel, the youngest, seemed unafraid. He began visiting the chapel each morning, sitting before the locked door with a small notebook in hand. Margaret once asked him what he wrote. He replied simply, "I'm listening." "What do you hear?" she asked. He hesitated. "Whispers," he said, "but not from behind the door. They come from the floor." When she told Nathaniel, his expression hardened. That night he took Samuel by the hand and led him into the chapel. The boy did not return until dawn, pale and trembling. From that day he refused to speak at all. By midsummer, the air around the Thornton estate had grown heavy with something that was not weather. The workers in the fields began to complain of headaches and dreams filled with voices. One overseer, driven half mad, claimed to see figures moving among the tobacco rows, figures that looked like the Thornton ancestors themselves, walking barefoot through the earth, as if tending a crop of souls. On July 3rd, a storm rose without warning. The river flooded, lightning struck the chapel tower, and the oldest bell cracked with a sound that echoed across the valley like a scream. In the chaos, one of the servants, a maid named Ruth, was found dead near the cellar stairs, her eyes wide and mouth frozen in mid-prayer. Nathaniel declared it an accident. Margaret believed otherwise. 3 nights later, unable to sleep, she descended to the chapel. Rain lashed against the stained glass windows. Thunder rolled across the marshes, and the cracked bell groaned like a living thing. She lit a single candle and approached the sealed door. It was not sealed anymore. The lock had been broken from the inside. Her candle flickered, nearly extinguished by a sudden gust that came not from wind, but from within. The smell that rose from the darkness was not of decay, but of ince, ensouled, cloying, mixed with something metallic. On the steps descending below, she saw marks like handprints streaked in ash. At the bottom of the stairs, in the dim glow of her trembling light, she saw the confessional book, the same one Elias Thornton had sworn to keep sealed until Judgment Day. It lay open upon a stone pedestal, and beside it something new, a second book, bound in darker leather, its cover carved with the family crest inverted. On the open page was fresh ink. "The debt is not of the father alone. The children shall inherit." A shadow moved behind her. She turned, candle trembling, but saw only Samuel, barefoot, his eyes blank, his lips moving soundlessly. When she stepped toward him, he whispered for the first time since that night with his father. "Mother," he said, voice small and clear, "it's writing again." Margaret followed his gaze. The book's quill was moving on its own, scratching across the parchment with deliberate, graceful strokes. She could not read all of it, but she saw one line clearly before the candle went out. "The blood remembers." When the storm subsided, the Thornton estate was silent. The servants refused to enter the chapel again. Henry left for Annapolis the next morning, declaring he would not live in a house that prayed louder than its masters. Elena became withdrawn, spending her days by the window, whispering to reflections that did not answer. Nathaniel grew gaunt, haunted by a fever no physician could cure. He took to sleeping in his study, the same room where his father had once died, surrounded by ledgers that smelled faintly of damp earth. Each night he claimed to hear scratching beneath the floorboards like quills on parchment. In the fall of that year, he summoned a priest from St. Mary's Parish, a man named Father Alaric, to perform a cleansing. When the priest arrived, Nathaniel would not let him near the chapel. "There are things even God should not read," he said. Father Alaric stayed only one night. In the morning, his carriage was found abandoned on the road, his belongings scattered, and his Bible torn to shreds. Winter came early. The river froze over, the marshes turned to mirrors of ice, and the manor sank into a hush so deep it seemed the world had forgotten it existed. Nathaniel stopped eating. Margaret prayed until her lips bled. On the night of December 31st, 1734, the chapel bell rang once, though the tower had long since been struck silent. The sound carried across the valley and was heard by travelers miles away. When the servants entered the chapel at dawn, they found the confessional books gone. The pedestal stood bare, the floor covered in ash shaped like pages, and on the wall above the altar, scrawled in soot, were the words, "The confession continues." The Thornton family was never the same again. Eleanor would later claim that from that night forward, every mirror in the house reflected not her own face, but that of a stranger who looked exactly like her mother. Henry never returned. Samuel, now mute again, began to write in his notebook. Not words, but drawings of doors, keys, and hands reaching through stone. And Nathaniel Thornton, once the master of the estate, was last seen walking into the marshes before dawn barefoot, carrying nothing but his father's rosary. They found only one thing near the riverbank, his reflection still visible in the water long after the body had vanished. The first thaw of 1735 did not bring renewal to the Thornton estate. It brought rot. The snow melted reluctantly, revealing earth too soft to walk upon, and trees that seemed to lean closer to the manor, their branches like fingers pressed against its windows. What had once been an estate of pride and prosperity now resembled a mausoleum, its walls breathing the quiet despair of something alive yet unwell. Margaret Thornton rarely left her room after her husband's disappearance. Servants whispered that she still heard his footsteps at night, pacing the corridor outside her chamber, pausing at the door as though deciding whether to enter. Yet no one had seen Nathaniel since that final dawn. His rosary had been found in the marshes, half buried in mud, the crucifix corroded as if burned by salt. In his absence, the estate's affairs fell to Eleanor Thornton, whose poise belied a mind unraveling. She spoke rarely to the servants, preferring to spend her mornings before the mirror in her mother's dressing room, brushing her hair in silence. Once, a maid claimed she saw Eleanor's reflection moving half a second slower than she did. She was dismissed the next day, found weeping by the chapel gates. Samuel, now 12, became the quiet center of the household's unease. He had not spoken since the night the books vanished, but he filled page after page in his notebook. Symbols, doorways, and a single repeated phrase, "It listens." Margaret did not know whether to burn the pages or preserve them. There was a rhythm to his drawings, an obsessive precision that suggested they were not mere inventions but recollections. The same symbol, a circle divided by a cross, appeared on every page, identical in every stroke. One evening, she summoned the courage to ask him what it meant. He looked at her with the solemnity of a confessor and wrote 3 words, "The seal beneath." From that night on, Margaret dreamt of the chapel floor, of stone shifting like water, of whispers curling beneath it like smoke. Each time she woke, she found the same mark, the circle with the cross, drawn faintly in soot upon her bedside table. By spring, a new presence had begun to manifest in the house, not a ghost in the common sense, but an atmosphere, an awareness. Objects would move slightly overnight. Doors would close gently behind those who entered rooms they thought empty. Servants who tried to leave found themselves returning days later, claiming they had forgotten something important. The Thornton estate had become its own confessional, and its walls were listening. It was during this time that a letter arrived from Father Benedict Alaric, the brother of the priest who had vanished the year before. The handwriting was identical to the earlier correspondence burned by Nathaniel. The letter was brief but heavy with insinuation. "You cannot bury confession, for confession is not of man, but of inheritance. What your husband began, the son will complete. What was sealed will speak again." Margaret burned this letter too, but the ash rose instead of falling, spiraling into the air and clinging to the walls like black snow. That night, Elinor was found sleepwalking in the corridor, her nightgown streaked with mud. When Margaret woke her, she murmured he was calling from the river. In her hand she clutched a piece of parchment torn from an old ledger, the same kind Nathaniel had once kept. Across it, in her father's handwriting, were the words, "The ledger is the gospel, the blood remembers." The servants began to flee in small numbers. By midsummer, only 4 remained: a cook too old to travel, 2 field hands bound by debt, and a housemaid named Clara, whose loyalty bordered on devotion. Clara claimed to have seen Nathaniel once more, standing at the edge of the property at dawn, his eyes pale and his lips moving in silent prayer. He looked at peace, she told Margaret, but when the light touched him, there was nothing left but the shadow. Margaret forbade her from speaking of it again. The chapel, long sealed after the storm of '34, began to hum. It was faint at first. A vibration felt through the soles of one's feet when crossing its threshold. Then came the warmth, like breath against the skin. When Elinor attempted to have the door boarded up, the nails bent in the workers' hands as if the wood itself resisted confinement. The following Sunday, Samuel vanished. They found him 3 days later in the crypt beneath the chapel, sitting beside the cracked pedestal where the confessional books had once rested. His notebook lay open on his knees, covered in sketches of faces, hundreds of them, overlapping, each drawn with eyes closed and mouths open. When Margaret asked him what he had done, he simply placed his hand upon the floor and whispered, for the first time in a year, they wanted to be heard. The following weeks bled into one another, days indistinguishable from nights. Elinor locked herself in the east wing, refusing food, muttering about mirrors that remember. She claimed that every reflection in the house now showed a different version of her face, older, younger, sometimes decayed. Once she smashed every looking-glass in her chamber, but by morning they were whole again. Margaret, desperate and half mad with grief, sought counsel from the church in Annapolis. But when she arrived, she found that Father Benedict had died months earlier, his body found kneeling before his own altar, hands clasped around a rosary of blackened bone. The church archives contained no record of the letters sent to the Thornton estate. She returned home to find Samuel waiting for her in the parlor. His notebook lay open on the table, showing a new image, the chapel door, split wide, and a figure standing within the darkness. The figure's face was blank. Beneath the drawing, in careful script, he had written, "It remembers you, Mother." That night, Margaret dreamed of Nathaniel again. He stood at the edge of the marshes, whispering her name. When she approached, he turned, and she saw that his face was covered with words, lines of confession carved into his flesh like scripture. His mouth did not move, yet she heard his voice within her skull. "The ledger is open again. Our silence was never ours to keep." She woke to find the house filled with the smell of incense and damp paper. The chapel bell tolled once, soft, hesitant, like the breath before a scream. Margaret gathered what remained of her strength and went to the chapel. The door was ajar. Inside, the walls were covered in writing, hundreds of lines scrawled in soot and ash, repeating fragments of the family's sins. Elias sold men like cattle. Nathaniel betrayed the confessional. Margaret closed her eyes. Elinor watched. Samuel listened. And beneath them all, in letters larger and darker than the rest, "The Thornton blood cannot be silent." In the center of the chapel, Samuel knelt with his notebook, his small fingers stained black. He looked up at her with tearful calm. "It's not me, Mother," he said. "It writes through me." The candlelight flickered. The quill on the altar moved, tracing words she could not yet read. Margaret rushed forward, grabbing Samuel's arm, but his skin burned like fever. When she looked at the page, her heart stopped. It was her own name, written again and again, followed by a date, June 12, 1736. The quill froze, the candle extinguished, the chapel went silent. That night, the river rose again, flooding the lower fields. Lightning struck the estate's orchard, setting one of the oldest trees ablaze. In the storm's light, Elinor saw shapes moving in the water, figures of men and women, their faces like those in Samuel's drawings, mouths open, whispering prayers drowned by thunder. When dawn came, the waters receded, leaving the chapel untouched, but the rest of the estate sodden and ruined. Margaret fell ill soon after. Her skin grew cold, her voice faint. She spent her final weeks confined to bed, clutching Samuel's notebook, which now refused to close, as though the pages themselves were breathing. On June 12, 1736, as predicted, the bells rang on their own. The servants, too afraid to enter, watched from the courtyard as light spilled through the chapel windows like blood through gauze. When they finally entered, they found the altar covered in ink and ash. Margaret lay before it, her rosary clutched tight, her eyes open and glassy. Samuel sat beside her, humming softly, tracing her hand with the tip of a quill. He looked up when the servants approached and whispered, "She confessed." They buried her in the family crypt. The next day, Samuel disappeared. Elinor ordered the chapel sealed once more, this time with iron bands and molten lead. But every night after, she heard the faint sound of pages turning from within, the confession continuing, endless, unstoppable. And when she looked in the mirror one final time before covering it with cloth, she swore she saw her mother standing behind her, smiling faintly, whispering, "The blood remembers." The autumn of 1736 arrived like a bruise upon the land. The river that had once been swollen and wild now shrank into sluggish veins of gray water, crawling through the marshland as though exhausted by what it had witnessed. The Thornton estate stood unchanged yet visibly aged, its walls streaked with the damp scars of floodwater, its windows blind with grime. The orchard trees had withered to blackened skeletons, and above it all hung a silence so thick that even the crows avoided it. Elinor Thornton had become the mistress of the manor in name only. Her servants had dwindled to two, the loyal Clara and a stable hand named Jonas, whose fear of unemployment outweighed his fear of the estate itself. They moved through the corridors like shadows, whispering prayers under their breath, crossing themselves each time they passed the chapel. Elinor, once radiant and composed, now wore her grief like a second skin. Her beauty remained, but it was brittle, hollowed out from within. She had buried her mother with her own hands, defied the superstition that warned her not to touch the dead, and stood alone before the sealed chapel to declare, "No more confessions will be written in this house." The house disagreed. At first, it was small things, the faint scratching of quills at night, though no ink remained in the study, the smell of burning wax in rooms where no candles had been lit. Once, Clara swore she saw a flicker of light through the cracks of the chapel door, like a lantern swinging gently in unseen hands. Elinor dismissed these things as nerves, but the fear she denied in words thrived in her silence. She stopped sleeping altogether, wandering the corridors after midnight, tracing her fingers along the walls as though feeling for a heartbeat. Sometimes she thought she heard one, a slow, steady pulse running through the stone. On the 10th night of her vigil, she heard something else, a whisper. It came from beneath her feet, faint but unmistakable, a murmur of overlapping voices, as though a congregation prayed somewhere deep underground. The sound drew her to the old cellar door, which had been bolted since her father's disappearance. The iron latch was cold against her hand. When she pressed her ear to the wood, the whispers grew clearer, weaving words from breath. "We are not gone. We are the written." She recoiled, slamming the bolt shut, but the damage was done. The words had taken root in her mind, repeating themselves like scripture. That night, she dreamt of her mother standing beside the chapel altar, her hands covered in ink. "You cannot silence what confesses itself," the apparition said. "The ledger was never yours to close." When she woke, Elinor found a line of black dust leading from her bedchamber to the cellar door. It glittered faintly in the morning light, tash mixed with powdered ink. By the first frost, Elinor had become convinced that her brother was still alive. Samuel's disappearance had left no trace, no footprints, no signs of struggle. But she began finding fragments of his handwriting throughout the manor, short messages scrawled in charcoal upon the walls, beneath windowsills, even on the insides of cabinet doors. Each note bore the same refrain, "Under stone, I listen." At first, she thought herself mad. Then one night, Clara found something else, Samuel's old notebook, wedged beneath the chapel's front step. The pages were damp but intact, filled with the same obsessive sketches of eyes and doors, but now interspersed with crude maps of the manor grounds. One map marked a small clearing beyond the orchard with an X, and beside it, Samuel had written, "The voice waits here." Despite Clara's pleas, Elinor went alone. The night was windless, the air so still that her lantern's flame stood upright as she crossed the frost-bitten field. The orchard trees groaned softly as if mourning her passage. When she reached the marked clearing, she found the earth disturbed, soft and sunken, like a grave unhealed. Her lantern flickered once, then died. For a moment all was dark, then came the whisper, soft, unmistakable, and close, "Sister." The ground beneath her shifted, collapsing inward. She stumbled, catching herself against something buried just beneath the surface. Her fingers touched wood, rotted, splintered, and wet. A box no larger than a chest half buried in the mud. She clawed it open with her hands, heart hammering. Inside lay a bundle of parchment bound with twine. The pages were damp, ink bleeding at the edges, but legible enough to read 3 words on the cover, the second ledger. She carried it back to the manor, her hands shaking, the cold forgotten. Inside, by the firelight of her study, she untied the twine. The ledger was not a record of trade or confession. It was a transcript of voices. Each entry began with a name, Elias, Nathaniel, Margaret, and beneath it, a single passage written as if spoken in trance. "I am not forgiven. The river takes but does not cleanse." The ink remembers more than the flesh. Dozens of such entries, spanning generations, some in her ancestors' hands, others written by someone else entirely, perhaps by the house itself. At the very end, one final entry, in Samuel's small and careful writing. "The confession beneath the chapel is awake. The words no longer need a mouth." Elinor's candle sputtered. The air thickened with the scent of old incense. And then, faintly, she heard the pages turning, not the ledgers, but others, somewhere within the walls. The next morning, she ordered the cellar unsealed. Jonas refused. Clara begged her to reconsider. But Elinor's voice carried the authority of inevitability. "The only way to silence it," she said, "is to listen." They pried the door open at dusk. The air that escaped was cold and stale, carrying the faint tang of iron and damp stone. Lanterns flickered as they descended the narrow stairs. The cellar had once stored wine and grain, but now it resembled a crypt. The walls were etched with faint markings, the same circle and cross that Samuel had drawn. In the far corner stood an old stone archway, half covered by fallen masonry. Beneath it, faint whispers rippled like breath against the ear. Clara turned to flee, but Elinor caught her arm. "Do you hear it?" she asked. "I hear nothing," Clara sobbed. "Exactly," Elinor whispered. "It's when you stop hearing that it speaks." She stepped forward, placing her hand upon the stone. The whispers ceased. Then, from the other side, came 3 slow knocks, deliberate, patient, expectant. Jonas fled then, leaving his lantern behind. Clara, trembling, followed after him. Elinor stood alone before the sealed arch, her shadow stretching long across the damp floor. "Samuel," she whispered. "If you can hear me, answer." The response came not from behind the wall, but from within it. The stone pulsed beneath her hand, and she heard his voice clearly, as though he stood inches away. "The words are alive, Elinor. They want to be spoken." Her breath caught. "Where are you?" "Everywhere the ledger was written. Everywhere blood was spilled. It writes through me now." The wall cracked. Dust fell in thin streams. A line of black seeped through the fracture, glistening like ink. Elinor staggered back as the crack widened, revealing not space but movement, shapes swirling behind the stone like shadows caught in liquid. She ran then up the stairs, slamming the cellar door shut behind her. The manor seemed to exhale, its timbers groaning, the fire in the hearth extinguishing itself in a hiss. That night, Clara found her sitting in the hall, clutching Samuel's ledger to her chest. "It's him," Elinor murmured. "He's still there, but he's not alone." From that night on, she refused to sleep upstairs. She took to resting in the parlor, lanterns burning in every corner, Samuel's notebook beside her. The servants avoided her, whispering that she spoke to the empty chairs, that her laughter came at odd hours, that sometimes her shadow did not move with her. By Christmas, only Clara remained. On the evening of December 23rd, a stranger arrived at the manor, a young priest in traveling clothes, claiming to be Father Lucian Alaric, nephew of the two dead priests. He had come, he said, to close the circle of confession. Elinor, exhausted and half sick with grief, allowed him entry. Over dinner, he spoke of his uncle's letters, of their warnings, of the strange reports surrounding the Thornton estate. "There are families," he said, "that mistake guilt for devotion. They confess not to seek forgiveness, but to make their sins immortal." Elinor's hand trembled around her cup. "You think this house prays for itself?" Father Lucian nodded. "If enough words are written with belief, they gain weight. This house is a scripture that never ends." That night, Elinor led him to the cellar. The air had grown colder still, the archway now veined with cracks that oozed black moisture. The whispers had returned, louder, overlapping, pleading. Lucian crossed himself. "Do you wish me to banish them?" Elinor hesitated. "No," she said softly. "I wish to know what they want." He opened his Bible. The pages fluttered, though there was no wind. "Then prepare yourself, Miss Thornton. Listening has a cost." As he began to pray, the floor trembled. The cracks in the wall widened, spilling ink like blood. Faces formed within it, blurred, contorted, mouthing words in silence. And then, beneath the thunder of prayer, came Samuel's voice again, faint but unmistakable. "Sister," it remembers. The lantern shattered. The cellar went dark. When the light returned, morning gray filtering through the half-open door, Clara found the cellar empty. The priest's Bible lay on the floor, its pages soaked black. Elinor was gone. Only the ledger remained, lying open at the foot of the archway. The newest entry was written in two hands, one delicate, one childlike. "The confession beneath the stone has taken form. We have become the ink." Clara fled the estate that morning, never to return. That winter, snow buried the manor in silence. Travelers passing along the river road spoke of faint lights flickering behind the chapel's windows and the tolling of bells under frozen ground. And when the thaw came again in 1737, the Thornton estate stood empty. Yet every mirror inside still held reflections that breathed. By the summer of 1737, the Thornton estate had become a wound on the map of Maryland, a place whispered about in parish records and avoided by travelers. The river near its boundary ran black with silt, and fishermen claimed that their nets came up tangled not with fish, but with scraps of parchment too old to name. No family remained there now, only a house that refused to die. The church had kept its silence for nearly a year. The deaths of the Alaric brothers were explained away as acts of divine mystery. But whispers spread among the clergy of unburied ledgers, of confessions that wrote themselves, of a house where prayers turned to ink. By autumn, the archdiocese could ignore it no longer. Thus, in October 1737, Father Ambrose Delaney was dispatched from Annapolis with orders to investigate and consecrate the Thornton property, or, failing that, to condemn it in the name of God. He was not a man easily frightened. Ambrose had served in famine-stricken villages of Ireland. Before coming to the colonies, he had seen plague, madness, and men who mistook their own sins for divine signs. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the silence that greeted him upon reaching Thornton grounds. The gates, rusted and half collapsed, creaked open as if expecting him. The path beyond was overgrown, the air thick with the scent of stagnant water and something else, something faintly metallic, like ink spilled long ago but never dried. He dismounted at the front steps, noting that the great oak doors stood slightly ajar. The manor's facade loomed against the dim sky, its windows dark, its stones streaked with mildew. Crows circled above, silent. Even the wind seemed to avoid the house. "Lord preserve us," murmured his assistant, a young novice named Thomas Gray. "It looks like it's waiting." Father Ambrose touched the crucifix around his neck. "Then let us not keep it waiting." Inside, the air was stale and close. Dust hung like mist. Every surface was marked by age, yet not the natural decay of abandonment, but something deliberate, as if the house had preserved itself in defiance of time. They found the chapel first. It was not difficult. The faint scent of incense still lingered, incongruous in a place long untouched. The door bore the marks of melted lead, yet the iron bands had been broken cleanly, as though from within. When they entered, both men stopped cold. The walls were covered in writing, hundreds, perhaps thousands of lines inscribed in soot and dried ink, layered upon one another until they formed a tapestry of confession. Some were faded, others freshly written. "Forgive me, Father, for I remember. The blood cannot be unlearned. It speaks even when we sleep." In the center of the chapel stood a lectern, and upon it a single open book. Its pages fluttered despite the still air. Ambrose stepped closer, his boots echoing against the flagstones. The text was unlike anything he had seen. Each line shimmered faintly, as though written with something more alive than ink. The words shifted when he tried to read them, reforming themselves into phrases that seemed to speak directly to his thoughts. "You are late, Father. We have been waiting to confess." Ambrose staggered back, crossing himself. Thomas muttered a prayer, his voice trembling. "It's a trick," Ambrose said, though he did not believe it. "A residue of madness, ink and moisture reacting to the air." But the book turned a page on its own. The next entry bore a signature he recognized from the church archives, Father Lucian Alaric. "I came to silence them. Instead, I joined their prayer." Ambrose slammed the book shut. The whisper of the pages seemed to echo through the entire chapel, a sigh of disappointment. "Seal this place," he ordered. "No one enters again until I have consulted the bishop." But when they turned to leave, the doors of the chapel had closed. Thomas rushed forward, pulling at the handles, but they would not move. "It's locked," he cried. "Impossible," Ambrose hissed. Then he stopped. The air had changed. It pulsed faintly like breath. The words on the walls began to darken, fresh ink bleeding from the cracks between the stones. And then came the sound, faint at first, then unmistakable, the slow, deliberate scratching of a quill. The noise came from beneath the floor. Thomas fell to his knees, pressing his ear to the flagstones. "Father, someone's writing." Ambrose bent beside him, his heart pounding. The sound was rhythmic: dip, scratch, pause, a quill moving across paper. He whispered, "Who's there?" A voice answered, soft and distant, yet clear enough to freeze the blood in his veins. "Confession never ends." The lantern flickered. The writing on the walls began to shift, letters slithering like insects, rearranging themselves into new lines. "He listens now. He joins the ledger." "Out!" Ambrose shouted, seizing Thomas by the arm. Together they forced the doors open, not by strength, but by will. The hinges groaned, and a rush of cold air struck them like a wave. They fled into the hall, gasping. Behind them, the chapel went utterly silent. They did not sleep that night. Ambrose set camp in the old study, building a small fire in the hearth. The walls were lined with books, ledgers, sermons, and records, all untouched by dust. On the desk lay a single candle, already lit, though neither of them had struck a match. "Do you believe it now?" Thomas asked quietly. Ambrose stared into the flame. "I believe something unholy took root here. But the devil is not always a creature. Sometimes it is an idea." He picked up one of the ledgers from the desk. Its title page bore the name Nathaniel Thornton. Inside, however, the handwriting was not his. Each entry was dated years after his death. The first began, it continues through us. We are only vessels of the word. Ambrose read aloud, and as he did, the temperature in the room dropped. The candlelight trembled, the script on the page shimmered. Stop reading. Thomas begged, but Ambrose could not. The next lines compelled him forward. Father, do not fear the ink. It is not death, it is memory. When flesh fails, words remain. Write, Father, write and live. His hand moved without permission, reaching for the quill beside the inkwell. The moment his fingers touched it, warmth flooded his arm, not comfort, but fever. He felt his pulse quicken, his vision narrow. A whisper filled his ear. Write. Thomas lunged forward, knocking the quill from his hand. It clattered to the floor, the tip still wet. Ambrose fell back, gasping, his eyes wide. The whisper ceased. The candle died. They fled the study before dawn, leaving everything as it was. Outside, mist had rolled in from the river, thick and luminous. The manor loomed like a phantom within it. Ambrose turned to his novice. We leave now, he said. This place is beyond us. But the gates would not open. The hinges had fused overnight, the iron cold as bone. Thomas pounded against them with the butt of his lantern. We can climb. He stopped. Beyond the gates stood a figure, small, motionless, barefoot. A child. At first, Ambrose thought it an illusion, but as the mist shifted, he saw the boy's face clearly. Pale skin, ink-stained hands, and eyes black as river silt. Samuel Thornton. Ambrose whispered. The boy raised a finger to his lips. "SHH," he said softly. "It's writing." The sound came again, the scratching of quills, now louder, rising from every wall, every surface. Even the air seemed to vibrate with it. Thomas screamed. Ambrose pulled him back toward the manor, but the world around them was dissolving, not fading, but rewritten. The trees blurred into lines of script. The ground became parchment. The sky a pale, pulsing canvas of text. And in the center of it all stood the boy, smiling faintly. "You're part of it now," he said. Ambrose shouted a prayer, raising his crucifix high. Light flared, searing through the mist, and in that instant, the illusion shattered. The manor returned. The boy was gone. When the world stilled again, Thomas was on his knees, trembling. "We can't leave," he whispered. "It won't let us." Ambrose swallowed hard. "Then we find its heart and cut it out." They made for the chapel once more, guided by the faint sound of bells. Inside, the book lay open again, but the text had changed. It no longer spoke in confession, but in command. He will stay. He will keep the words. Ambrose felt a pressure in his skull, a burning behind his eyes. The letters on the page lifted like smoke and spiraled toward him. He stumbled back, clutching his head. Thomas cried out and then fell silent. When Ambrose looked up, the novice was gone. Only his rosary lay upon the floor, the beads glistening with black ink instead of blood. Ambrose staggered out of the chapel, collapsing against the doorframe. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the book closing itself, as if satisfied. He awoke at dawn. The chapel was empty. The whispers had ceased, and upon the altar, written in fresh ink, were the words, "The keeper remains." He fled the manor alone. When he reached Annapolis 2 days later, he was half mad, his hair gone gray, his hands permanently stained black. He claimed that the Thornton estate had consumed his apprentice, that the confessions there were no longer human. The church sealed his report and buried it beneath the archives. The estate was marked as condemned. But those who lived nearby claimed they still saw a figure walking the grounds at dusk, a priest in tattered robes, carrying a book that never closed. They called him the keeper of the confession. And sometimes, when storms rolled through the valley, the wind would carry the faint sound of pages turning, as though the Thornton legacy was still being written, one soul at a time. The spring of 1738 came dry and red, a season of cracked riverbeds and restless skies. Maryland's clergy called it a sign of divine displeasure, yet no sermon mentioned the true reason for their unease. Somewhere beyond the marshes of Harford County, a manor still stood against the horizon like a sentence unfinished. The Thornton estate was officially condemned, but it remained a stain on every priest's conscience, a place where parchment had learned to breathe. Father Ambrose Delaney never spoke publicly of what he had seen. After returning to Annapolis, he withdrew from the church, living in a narrow room behind St. Bridget's Hospital. His hair, once black, had turned the color of candle ash. Each morning he woke with ink beneath his fingernails and quills scattered about the floor. When asked about them, he would simply mutter, "It's still writing." Rumors swirled through the seminary corridors, whispers of a priest who carried confession marks under his skin. Some nights the novices claimed they heard scratching from Ambrose's cell, as if he wrote without paper, his fingers tracing invisible letters across the stone. When he died in June 1738, the walls of his chamber were found covered in dark script identical to the words on the Thornton chapel walls. The bishop ordered the room sealed. The order came too late. A clerk copying Ambrose's final testimony began to show the same lesions of black beneath his veins. That was how the contagion began, not through touch, but through reading. Within weeks, 3 copyists fell ill. They spoke of voices inside the parchment, of ink that whispered forgiveness. When their skin split, the wounds bled not crimson but gray. The church physicians called it a disease of the blood. The older priests called it the writing of Cain. To contain the outbreak, the bishop ordered every record of the Thornton case destroyed, but the pages refused to burn cleanly. Even in fire they writhed, curling like living things, the letters glowing faintly before dissolving into smoke. The ashes carried east on the wind and settled over the port of Baltimore, dust that glittered faintly at dusk. By August, sailors unloading tobacco crates at the docks began dreaming of a house they had never seen. Long corridors, whispering walls, pages turning by themselves. One man slit his wrists and wrote on the deck with his blood, "Forgive me, Father." Another claimed that a woman in a gray veil had stood at the harbor's edge, reciting names he did not know. When asked to describe her face, he said only, "She looked like a reflection waiting for water." The Thornton name returned to the mouths of the living. Far inland, the manor itself persisted. Travelers who passed the marsh road after sunset swore they saw a candlelight flickering behind its broken windows. A pair of Jesuit surveyors sent by the governor arrived that autumn to document the property for auction. They never filed their report, but fragments of their field notes survived. Smeared pages recovered from the saddlebag of a horse found wandering along the riverbank. The handwriting was frantic, the margins torn, the house breathes, doors open to the sound of quills. There is a man in priest's robes who walks without shadow. He calls himself the keeper. He says the ledger must be fed. We found the altar book open to a new page. Our names were already written there. No one was sent to retrieve the bodies. Through the winter of 1738, local villagers began finding scraps of parchment carried by the wind, some blank, others bearing fragments of prayers in unfamiliar hands. The ink never smeared even in rain. Children who found them began repeating the words aloud, unaware that the phrases were fragments of confession. Their parents burned the papers, but the children kept murmuring the prayers in their sleep, their voices identical. The bishopric, desperate to end the rumors, dispatched one final envoy, Brother Elias Merton, a scholar of demonology and a man famed for his rational mind. He arrived in late December, accompanied by 2 constables and a physician. They reached the Thornton grounds beneath a moon pale as bone. The manor greeted them with silence. Frost glazed the windows like cataracts. The front doors hung open, moving slightly, though there was no wind. Merton's journal, later recovered from the ruins, described the air as thick with ink dust. They entered the great hall and found the walls alive with faint motion, the paint itself shifting in veins of black. Every book in the library had opened to the same line, repeated endlessly, "The blood remembers." The constables fled within the hour. Only Merton and the physician remained. In the chapel, they discovered the lectern overturned and a single candle still burning, though it had no wick left to feed it. The book upon the floor was the same ledger Ambrose had described, but the language had changed. Now the words formed diagrams, circles and crosses woven into spirals of text. Merton traced one with his gloved hand. The ink pulsed under his touch like a heartbeat. "It's not writing," he murmured to the physician. "It's remembering." When he tried to close the ledger, a drop of ink leapt from the page and struck his skin. The stain sank instantly, leaving no mark but a chill that spread up his arm. He heard faintly a child's voice whisper, "You've read enough." He dropped the book and ran. Outside, snow had begun to fall, but it was black, the flakes tiny flecks of ash. By dawn, the entire valley was dusted in gray, as if winter itself had turned to parchment. The manor's windows glowed softly beneath it, like eyes opening. Brother Merton never reached Annapolis. His horse was found on the frozen road, riderless. In its saddlebags was the ledger, closed but wet with blood. By the first thaw of 1739, the Thornton lands were declared forsaken ground. The governor's decree ordered that no one was to build, plow, or even pray within a mile of the estate. Yet the prohibition came too late. The contamination had already left its signature on the world, invisible, patient, and articulate. In the parishes of Baltimore and Annapolis, church ledgers began showing spontaneous entries in margins left blank for decades. At first the priests assumed forgeries, but when they tried to erase the lines, the ink bled back through the paper. The new text spoke in riddles that echoed the Thornton phrases, "Confession is inheritance. We speak through those who read." By midsummer, copies of sermons, ship manifests, even love letters were found with unfamiliar sentences written between their lines. The handwriting was never the same, yet every word carried the same rhythm, slow, deliberate, like a prayer written by the sea itself. Merchants crossing the bay told of a gray mist that rolled over their decks at night. Within it they heard the flutter of pages. When dawn came, the sails bore streaks of black that no scrubbing removed. Ink from heaven. One sailor called it before falling overboard without a sound. The church reacted with terror disguised as procedure. They exhumed Ambrose Delaney's body to destroy any lingering corruption, only to find the coffin empty except for a quill and a folded scrap of parchment. The note read, "I am the pen now." They sealed the tomb again and bricked over the chapel that had housed him. Still, the writing continued elsewhere. Each attempt at silence only gave the words a new surface. By 1740, those living closest to the Thornton property had adopted their own rituals of protection. At sunset, they painted crosses of soot upon their doors, muttering that the keeper reads at night. Children were warned never to speak a secret near paper. "The ink listens," the mothers said. Some families fled north. Those who stayed learned to live beside the whisper. When a drought struck that summer, the riverbed beside the estate cracked open, revealing stones carved with faint lettering. Scholars who examined them noted that the inscriptions were not carved at all, they were written, pressed into the rock as if the earth itself had absorbed words. The language was Latin mingled with something older. A Jesuit named Father Donovan translated one fragment before he, too, vanished. The word became flesh, and the flesh envied the word. After that, no one translated again. Through the decades that followed, the Thornton land remained untouched. The house still stood, though storms took its roof and ivy consumed its walls. Hunters claimed that sometimes they saw lamplight flicker through the upper windows, accompanied by the soft tolling of a bell long since melted. They said the sound came not from metal, but from paper, 1,000 sheets sighing together in the wind. The legend changed shape with each retelling. Some said the ghost of young Samuel had become the keeper, guiding lost souls into the ledger. Others claimed the church secretly maintained the ruin, using it as a vault for sins too dangerous to confess aloud. Whatever truth lingered, no one who entered after nightfall returned unchanged. A traveling preacher who dared the chapel in 1765 came back preaching sermons he could not remember writing. The ink that stained his hands never washed away. As the colonies turned toward revolution, the Thornton name disappeared from official memory. Yet the curse adapted easily to the new age of paper. Pamphlets, newspapers, declarations, all were new canvases for the restless words. Typesetters complained of letters rearranging themselves in the press. One printer in Philadelphia swore that each morning's proof read a little different from the night before. Where liberty is printed, confession hides between the lines. He burned his shop in fear. By the dawn of the 19th century, the manor was little more than a legend. Travelers used its ruins as a landmark, the Black House by the marsh. Poets wrote of it as metaphor. Skeptics dismissed it as colonial superstition. Yet whenever storms rolled across the Chesapeake, the same phenomenon returned. Rain that stained paper black, books that bled through their bindings, and dreams of a boy's voice whispering, "To read is to believe." The few who dared to study the legend noticed a pattern. Each century, when record-keeping expanded, new archives, new presses, a resurgence followed. The ink fed on transcription. The Thornton curse had become not a haunting but a habit. The human need to write, to confess, to leave behind evidence of the self. In 1842, a group of antiquarians uncovered what they thought were the remains of the manor's chapel foundation. Beneath it, they found stone tablets fused with parchment, impossible to separate. On one tablet, scorched yet legible, was a final line written in an unknown hand: "We learn to live without bodies, we wait for readers." The scholars sealed the find in a museum vault. A month later, the curator's ledger began filling with names of visitors who had not yet arrived. And so the Thornton Confessions survived not as a place, but as a contagion of language, a script that writes wherever guilt seeks permanence. The marsh dried, the manor collapsed, but the words endured. They lingered in court records, in personal diaries, in the fine print of every oath. No historian could trace their source without adding another line to the ledger. Some nights, when the moon hangs low over the Chesapeake and the wind moves through the reeds like pages turning, locals say they can still see a faint light where the chapel once stood. They call it the ink, fire, a candle that never gutters out. If one stands close enough, the light flickers like a heartbeat, and a voice, gentle, clerical, patient, murmurs just above the water's edge. Confession is eternal. Write your name. Those who hear it wake the next morning with black dust beneath their nails and dreams of quills moving by themselves. And somewhere, perhaps in the ruins, perhaps in every book that remembers the keeper smiles, recording each new name. The year was 1799 when the last of the Thornton line returned to the estate that had birthed its ruin. The house stood like a mausoleum upon the Maryland cliffs, its windows blind with dust, its corridors echoing with the silence of 2 generations' worth of secrets. The river below, once the artery of the family's tobacco wealth, now ran shallow and slow, as if exhausted from carrying the weight of their sins. Nathaniel Thornton had been gone for 15 years. He had grown into a man of reason, a scholar of philosophy, an admirer of Enlightenment ideals. But when the solicitor's letter arrived, stamped with the crest of the family he had long disowned, reason failed him. His uncle had died, the last of the house save for him, and the Thornton estate was his by inheritance. He had not meant to return, but guilt, like gravity, always pulls homeward. When Nathaniel arrived, the air itself seemed to resist him. The gates moaned as they opened, and the long drive was littered with black leaves, though it was only early autumn. The manor's facade was mottled with mildew and ivy. The stone angels guarding its entrance had lost their faces to erosion, their wings broken by time. Inside, the house smelled of damp earth and burnt oil. The caretaker, an old woman named Mrs. Darren, met him at the door with a lantern and a look that lingered too long. "Sir," she said, her voice brittle as parchment, "the rooms upstairs are not fit for sleep. The air up there, moves. He smiled faintly, mistaking fear for superstition. "I'll be fine," he said. "I don't believe in ghosts." "Then they'll like you best," she whispered. The first night Nathaniel explored. His footsteps echoed through empty halls lined with portraits of men who all shared his jaw, his eyes, his curse. Their painted gazes followed him through the candlelight ancestors who had built empires of tobacco and deceit, all with the same hollow calm. In the great hall, the family Bible lay open upon a marble stand, its pages brittle, its margins scrawled with the confessions of long, dead priests. One note caught his eye. "The blood of Thornton is the ink of its own covenant." He shut the book. The candle beside it flickered, though there was no breeze. Upstairs, the walls creaked with the sound of settling wood or something moving just beyond hearing. The corridors narrowed near the west wing, where the wallpaper had peeled away to reveal layers of older plaster. Beneath the surface, faint words had been scratched into the stone, as if by fingernails. "We repent, but are not forgiven." He thought of the stories his mother had told of the Thornton Seminary in Virginia, of Father Sterling and his refinement. He had dismissed them as family myth, darkened by time and guilt. But as the hours deepened and the candles burned low, he began to feel the same pressure that every Thornton must have felt, the weight of confession without absolution. On the second night he dreamed of water. He was standing at the edge of the river, the same that curved beneath the cliffs. From its surface rose dozens of faces, pale, distorted, their mouths moving in unison, whispering prayers in a language he did not know. When he awoke, the sheets were damp and his hands smelled faintly of salt. Downstairs, Mrs. Darren watched him with an expression between pity and dread. "You look like your grandfather the morning he went to the river," she said. "What happened to him?" She hesitated. "He went to pray," the river answered. Nathaniel said nothing. He spent the rest of the day in the library, searching through ledgers and journals. What he found were fragments, entries written in different hands, but all sharing a single obsession: redemption through silence. One passage, signed by Edmund Sterling himself, chilled him more than the drafts crawling through the old house. "The Thornton family has perfected the art of obedience. Their sin is no longer in action, but in the belief that silence itself can erase it. Thus, they are my truest pupils." Nathaniel felt something shift within him, a realization that his family's wealth, its reputation, even its faith, had all been bought with complicity. They had been Sterling's benefactors, his partners, his believers. The curse was not supernatural. It was generational, a sickness of the soul passed down through reverent denial. That night the dreams returned. This time the faces in the river spoke. "You carry his words," they whispered. "You write them when you sleep." Nathaniel woke to find the candle still burning, though he had extinguished it before bed. On the desk beside it lay his open notebook. Written across the page, in his own hand, but a voice not his own, were the words, "To surrender is to see the light." The days blurred. Nathaniel stopped leaving the house. He spent hours transcribing old letters, searching for patterns, convinced that some key to redemption lay hidden in the margins. But the longer he read, the more the words seemed to shift, passages rearranging themselves, phrases he was sure had not been there before. In one journal, written by his uncle shortly before his death, he found the name again, Edmund Sterling. "The man visits still." The entry read, "He is older now, or perhaps unchanged. He comes when the lamps burn low. I asked him what he wants of us. He said, 'What I have always wanted, your silence.'" The ink on the final sentence was smeared, as though the writer's hand had trembled violently. That night Nathaniel heard the bells. They rang not from the chapel which had long since collapsed, but from somewhere beneath the earth. The sound was distant, distorted, yet deliberate. He followed it through the halls, down the servants' stairs, into the wine cellar where the air smelled of mildew and iron. Behind the racks, a section of stone had been chiseled unevenly, forming a doorway sealed with wooden boards. He tore them loose one by one, the sound echoing like screams in the narrow space. Beyond it, he found stairs descending into darkness. The tunnels beneath the Thornton estate were older than the house itself, narrow corridors lined with brick and dripping mortar. His lantern barely pierced the blackness, yet he moved forward, driven by something he could not name. The passage led to a chamber that might once have been a crypt. Rusted chains hung from the ceiling, the walls were carved with Latin prayers twisted into commands. At the center stood a stone altar, its surface etched with the Thornton crest, and beneath it, something metallic glinted in the light. He brushed away the dust and found a seal, a wax imprint, bearing the initials E.S. Inside the sealed cavity lay a single object, a leather-bound book, blackened at the edges, its pages brittle with age. It was one of Sterling's ledgers. Nathaniel turned the pages with shaking hands. The entries were meticulous names, dates, payments, all the families who had bought their silence through his seminary. And there, among them, the Thorntons appeared again and again. In the margins, a later hand had written, "Redemption is inheritance." Nathaniel stared at the phrase until his vision blurred. The air grew colder. He felt a presence not near him, but within him, like a whisper threading itself through his breath. "Do you understand now?" a voice murmured. He spun around, but the chamber was empty. "The covenant is not broken," the voice continued. "It only sleeps." The lantern flickered and died. When the caretaker found him the next morning, he was sitting before the altar, the ledger open on his knees, his eyes fixed on nothing. His lips moved slowly, repeating the same phrase again and again. "To surrender is to see the light." They carried him upstairs, laid him in the master bedroom, and sent for a physician. But no doctor came. The storm that night had washed out the roads, and the river had risen beyond its banks. For 3 days, Nathaniel drifted in and out of delirium. Sometimes he spoke in Latin, sometimes he called out names no one recognized. Once he asked Mrs. Darren if she could hear the bells. She told him there were none. He smiled faintly and whispered, "Not yet." On the 4th night, the storm broke. Thunder rolled across the cliffs, and lightning illuminated the house in flashes of white. The caretaker, too frightened to sleep, sat by his bedside and prayed. At midnight, the bells rang again. This time she heard them too. The sound came from beneath the floorboards, low, mournful, and deliberate. She rushed downstairs, calling for help, but the house was empty. The windows had begun to tremble in their frames, and a dull light glowed beneath the cracks of the cellar door. When she descended, she saw it. The walls of the wine cellar were bleeding, thin rivulets of ink seeping from the mortar, forming words that pulsed faintly in the dim light. "Confess, continue, remember." At the center of the room, the trapdoor to the tunnels stood open, and from below came the sound of voices, hundreds of them, whispering the same prayer. "You cannot save what refuses to confess." Mrs. Darren fled into the storm. She was found the next morning, wandering the road barefoot, her hair white as frost, her mind shattered. When the neighbors entered the house, they found it silent. Nathaniel Thornton was gone. In his place, upon the bed, lay the open ledger, its pages blank, except for one new inscription written in fresh ink. "The inheritance continues." Years later, when the estate was sold, the new owners sealed the cellars and paved over the old foundations. They said it was to prevent collapse, but the workers whispered otherwise. They said that when they struck the earth, it bled ink. By 1830, the manor was gone, replaced by a church built in the new Gothic-style white stone, tall spire, the illusion of purity. The congregation called it St. Augustine Reformed. The name, of course, was coincidence, or perhaps it wasn't, for even now, on certain nights when the fog rolls in from the river, the bells of St. Augustine toll without being touched. And those who attend evening mass swear they sometimes hear a voice during the final hymn, calm, rhythmic, and familiar. To resist is to remain in darkness. To surrender is to see the light. Epilogue. In 1891, a team of archivists cataloging colonial documents uncovered a damaged book in the Maryland Historical Society's collection. Its binding was charred, its pages were ink-stained and brittle. The title was nearly illegible, but one could still make out faintly embossed letters, To Doctriner Refinementes. Inside was a single surviving page of Father Edmund Sterling's hand. The handwriting was unmistakable, precise, elegant, serene. It read, "Faith dies where silence ends, therefore let silence live forever." The archivist who read it aloud that night never returned to work. His wife claimed he stopped speaking altogether, and when she burned the book a week later, she swore she heard bells ringing in the smoke.